The sun sagged low over the red-skinned hills, an ember sinking slowly toward the edge of the world. The trail to Silver Hollow shimmered beneath its heat, rippling like a mirage. The stagecoach rattled along with the exhausted groan of a beast pushed too far, dust curling behind its wheels in long, chalky ribbons. Inside the coach sat the Dalton twins, Maggie and Lucy, two striking, full-figured sisters whose matching dark braids clung to their shoulders like silk ropes. Though 22 and identical in face, they were opposites in temperament. Maggie watched the world with calm resolve. Lucy met it with restless spark. Both carried the gentle strength of women raised to work with their hands. Their aunt's schoolhouse waited somewhere at the end of this rattling, uncooperative road. Lucy adjusted her skirt with an impatient sigh. 5 more miles, Maggie. Maybe less, she muttered, if this coach doesn't fall into pieces first. As if offended, the stagecoach lurched, then groaned, then stopped entirely with a sound that whispered, "This is the end of my patience." The driver cursed. The horses stamped. Dust floated through the air like drifting ash. Maggie leaned toward the window, parting the curtain with steady fingers. Beyond the trail the land glowed crimson, pines rising like dark sentinels against the dying sun. She inhaled sharply. Lucy sensed it instantly. "What is it?" "Hooves. Fast ones," Maggie whispered. The ground trembled, soft, subtle, then unmistakable. A distant thunder, a rhythm too quick, too many, the kind of sound that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. Then they appeared, 17 riders cresting the ridge in jagged silhouettes, their shapes rippling through the settling dusk. They fanned outward, circling the stalled coach. Boots scraped, spurs clinked, dust crawled up around them like smoke. Their leader rode closest, a tall brute carved of leather and bone. A pale scar slashed his cheek like a white-hot brand. His grin was wolfish. "Well now," he drawled, leaning down to peer through the cracked window. "Ain't often we find fine ladies wandering this far west." Lucy's breath hitched. Maggie's jaw tightened, though fear curled icy fingers around her spine. "We've nothing of value. Please let us go," Lucy said, voice trembling. The man laughed, a sound that left the world feeling colder. "Oh, there's value in all sorts of things," he murmured, reaching through the window. His fingers closed around Maggie's wrist, hot and possessive. Before Maggie could yank herself free, before Lucy could scream, the entire canyon snapped with a single ear-splitting gunshot. The scarred man cried out, falling from his saddle, clutching his leg. Horses reared, men shouted, dust exploded upward in frantic clouds. Every outlaw's head jerked toward the ridge. Up on the hill stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, carved from shadow and sunset. A wide-brimmed hat slanted across his brow. His rifle rested steady against his shoulder. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't waver. His voice rolled across the canyon, deep, calm, dangerous. "Mount up and ride. You've got 10 seconds to be out of my sight." 10 seconds. The men cursed, panicked, scrambled for reins. Even the horses seemed to know better than to disobey that voice. They vanished down the slope in a storm of dust and hoofbeats, leaving behind only the fading echo of their fury. Silence draped over the canyon like a heavy blanket. The stranger descended the ridge with collected ease, as though he had done this 100 times before. The closer he came, the clearer he appeared, tall as a barn beam, shoulders broad enough to shadow the ground beneath him. His presence carried a weight, not of menace, but of capability, the kind of man that had seen more trouble than he ever talked about. He stopped beside the coach and tipped his hat to the sisters. "Name's Gideon Hail. You ladies all right?" Maggie nodded, though her pulse still thudded wildly in her throat. "You saved our lives." "Maybe," Gideon murmured. His eyes were sharp, assessing the broken wheel, the injured driver, the dying daylight. "But you can't stay out here tonight. My cabin's 5 miles north. I'll take you there safe." Lucy's eyes widened. "We don't want to trouble you." "Too late for thinking you ain't already in trouble," he said simply. The sisters exchanged a look, a silent conversation in the span of one breath. Maggie gave a short nod. "We'll come." They mounted the horses, Maggie riding behind her sister on a spare mare, while Gideon led on a massive black stallion that moved with uncanny quiet. The trail wound through the foothills, the air cooling fast. Twilight thickened around them, pine shadows stretching like long fingers. Lucy broke the silence first. "You said you were tracking those men." Gideon nodded without looking back. "They've been hitting coaches for weeks. I hoped to stop them before someone got hurt." "You did," Maggie said softly. He didn't answer, only kept watch on the horizon. By the time they reached his cabin, a sturdy, humble thing tucked among pines, night had fallen. Smoke curled from the chimney. Warmth greeted them as Gideon ushered them inside. He made coffee, warmed beans, and insisted they take the bed. "Floor will do fine for me," he said, refusing argument. In the glow of lamplight, his features softened, still chiseled, still serious, but touched by something gentler. "You two headed to Silver Hollow?" he asked. "To reopen our aunt's schoolhouse," Maggie said. "A tough town, but maybe tough towns need soft things." Maggie held his gaze, feeling something strange stir. Respect, gratitude, and something unnamed. Outside, the wind brushed the cabin walls. Inside, the world felt smaller, safer. Just before sleep took her, Maggie heard Gideon's low voice, barely a whisper, maybe to himself, maybe to them. "We'll escape tonight together." And though she couldn't explain why, the words settled deep, like a promise meant for the dark.
The sun had barely begun to wash the hills in pale gold when Gideon Hail stepped outside his cabin, boots crunching lightly across frost-kissed grass. The morning was quiet, a rare, reverent quiet, broken only by the distant call of a hawk. Behind him, through the cracked cabin door, the Dalton twins stirred softly, waking into the strange safety of a place they never meant to find. Maggie emerged first, her thick black hair tumbled over her shoulders, her warm brown skin catching the soft light as though it belonged to the land itself. She moved with the calm certainty of someone who had learned long ago to survive inconvenience without complaint. Lucy followed, nearly identical in face but brighter in energy, her gaze wide with wonder and nerves in equal measure. Gideon nodded at them, then gestured toward the fence post at the edge of the clearing. "If you're going to live in Silver Hollow, you'll need to know more than reading and sums." Lucy arched a brow. "We can shoot?" "Maybe," he replied, the corner of his mouth twitching, "but you ain't learned from me yet." There was something teasing in his tone, something anchored by the gravity of a man who'd seen too many bullets fly. Maggie sensed the weight beneath the humor. She stepped closer. "Then teach us." Gideon didn't waste words. He set 3 empty bottles along the fence, spaced wide, each one a fragile challenge. The frost glinted on their curved surfaces, crystals catching in the early light. He handed Maggie the rifle first. The metal was cold, heavy, familiar yet foreign. She'd shot before, twice, years ago, but never under the eye of a man like Gideon Hail, who seemed carved from the rules of survival themselves. "Stand square," Gideon instructed, moving behind her. "Weight even. Shoulders loosened. Don't grip, the rifle owes you money." His voice was low, steady as a drumbeat. Maggie inhaled. She raised the rifle, sighting down the length of it. Her hands felt unsteady. The bottle blurred. Her breath hitched. The gunshot rang loud, echoing across the hills, and the bullet buried itself nowhere near the target. Lucy laughed in shock. Maggie's cheeks warmed. Gideon stepped in close behind her, his presence solid and grounding. He adjusted her stance with gentle, firm touches, fingers on her elbows, a guiding hand on her shoulder, the faint heat of him steadying her spine. "You're trying too hard," he murmured, nearly at her ear. "Don't fight the rifle. Let it breathe. Let it be what it is." Maggie exhaled. She focused, not on fear, not on failure, but on the rhythm of her breath, the earth beneath her boots, the soft wind skimming her skin. She squeezed the trigger. The bottle shattered in an explosion of glass that glittered like stars thrown into daylight. Lucy cheered. Maggie blinked, stunned, a small smile blooming across her lips. Gideon stepped back, arms crossed. Better. Now it was Lucy's turn. If Maggie was deliberate, Lucy was instinct. She raised the rifle with flair, tipped her chin defiantly, and fired. The second bottle burst cleanly. Lucy nearly dropped a gun in delight. "Ha! Told you!" Gideon's smirk deepened, but it was a smirk warmed by pride, not ego. "Guess I underestimated you two." The lesson stretched deep into morning. Birds called overhead. The frost melted beneath the rising sun. Shot after shot rang across the clearing until the Dalton sisters stood among shards of glass and settling smoke, their shoulders trembling from exertion, their cheeks flushed with victory. Gideon gathered the spent shells in silence. He wasn't a man of praise. His approval lived in the subtle softening of his eyes, the quiet nod when Lucy reloaded without being told, the nearly imperceptible smile when Maggie hit a moving tin can he had tossed into the air. By the time the sun stood high, the sisters were sweating, laughing, arguing over who shot straighter. The fear of the previous night felt distant, softened by the growing warmth between them and the man who had stepped into their lives like a thunderclap. Afterwards, Gideon led them back to the coach. The driver, now patched and resting, raised a grateful hand. Gideon crouched beside the broken wheel, examining it with the patience of a man accustomed to fixing things alone. "You really do know everything," Lucy teased. He shook his head. "I know enough." With leather straps, a crowbar, and quiet determination, he repaired the wheel. He lifted the trunks, heavy as stone, yet lightweight in his arms, and set them neatly inside the coach. When he finished, he walked the sisters to their horses. "You two ride together," he said, nodding at the mare, "and stay close." He mounted his own stallion, a black, powerful beast whose muscles rolled beneath its hide like deep water. Gideon rode as though the land belonged to him, his eyes constantly roaming the horizon, every sense attuned. The descent into the valley was slow, cautious. Silver Hollow revealed itself gradually, a huddle of wooden buildings nestled beside a narrow stream, smoke rising from straight chimneys. Children chased chickens in the dusty street. Men hauled crates. Women hung linens from sagging ropes. It wasn't much, but there was life. Sheriff Tom Avery, stout and broad-souled, met them at the edge of town. His heavy mustache twitched as Gideon spoke in low tones, explaining the attack. Avery's face darkened. "We'll take care of it." He gripped Gideon's hand. He turned to the sisters. "Your aunt's schoolhouse is still standing. Roof leaked some, but it's yours." The schoolhouse sat quiet at the far end of town. Paint faded to the color of old bones. Inside, dust lay thick, desks crooked, windows cracked. But Maggie stepped in as though entering a temple. She ran her hand along a wooden desk, her eyes filling with something soft and hopeful. "It's perfect," she whispered. Gideon helped carry their trunks inside. When Lucy thanked him, he only nodded. When Maggie met his gaze, something flickered, something that made her heart tremble. As he adjusted the lock on the door, Gideon stepped back. "You'll be safe here," he said, "but keep these doors bolted at night." "You say that like you're leaving." I usually do. They invited him to supper anyway. Inside the lantern glow, over bread and coffee, the three of them fell into a quiet that felt easy, earned, not forced. When Gideon finally rose to leave, Maggie walked him to the porch. The sky was bruised purple, the first stars trembling awake. "You saved us," she said softly. "I just happened to be there." "No, you chose to help." For a beat of heart, Gideon held her gaze, steady, unreadable, yet strangely gentle. "Rest easy tonight," he murmured. "I'll be close." And as he walked away, Maggie felt a strange certainty settle inside her chest. This wasn't the last time they'd see him. Something had begun at dawn, something she didn't have words for yet, but felt deep in the quiet parts of herself.
Silver Hollow woke slowly each morning, as though the sun had to persuade it back into motion. Smoke drifted from early chimneys, roosters barked, and shopkeepers swept dust from their doorsteps. The Dalton twins adapted with surprising quickness. By the second week, Maggie and Lucy had scrubbed the schoolhouse walls, polished the bell, aired the quilts, and arranged the desks into tidy rows that made the spare little building feel like the beginning of something hopeful. Children trickled in shyly at first, wide-eyed ranch kids with dusty boots, braids undone, and pockets full of marbles. Maggie greeted each one with the soft confidence of someone meant to be listened to. Lucy fluttered among them like a breeze, coaxing smiles from even the smallest, most wary face. The schoolhouse filled with laughter, chalk dust, and the sweet chaos of lessons. Silver Hollow noticed. It noticed the way Maggie stood firm at the blackboard, patient but unyielding. It noticed the way Lucy wove warmth into every corner, stitching the community together with her quick grin. And it noticed, perhaps more keenly than anything else, the tall, silent man who came and went without ceremony. Gideon Hail. He repaired the schoolhouse roof without being asked. He cleared the path behind the building. He checked the locks at dusk and the windows at dawn. The townsfolk began to murmur, first curiosities, then questions, then assumptions. Who's he to those Dalton girls? Where'd he come from? What's he running from? Some whispered kindly, some whispered otherwise. Gideon ignored whispers the way a stone ignores wind, but Maggie heard every one. Sometimes she watched him from the window while the children packed their bags to go home. He would stand with one foot on the step, rolling his sleeves, eyes fixed on the hills, as though expecting danger to walk out of them. One late afternoon, after the last student had left, Maggie stepped outside to find Gideon perched on the railing, whittling a scrap of wood into something shapeless and delicate. The sun dipped low, staining his profile in soft bronze. She approached quietly. "You look restless." Gideon's knife paused. "Just listening." "To what?" "The land," he said simply. Before she could reply, the rumble of hooves echoed down the street. A man rode toward the sheriff's office, dust trailing behind him in a smoky cloud. He was lean, sharp-faced, wearing a coat that looked like it had traveled farther than its owner deserved. A long, dark pistol hung at his hip, too worn to be ornamental, too cared for to be idle. Sheriff Avery stepped outside as the stranger dismounted. The town stilled. The stranger tipped his hat. "Name's Elias Ward. I'm looking for a man goes by Gideon Hail." Maggie froze. Gideon's shoulders tensed, but he said nothing. Ward continued, loud enough for every passing ear. "He's wanted for questioning on a matter concerning the Hollow Creek boys." Whispers erupted like bees from a hive. Maggie's heart lurched. She glanced at Gideon, expecting him to deny it outright, but he didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move. Sheriff Avery frowned. "Gideon, is there truth to what he's saying?" Gideon lifted his gaze. I rode with the Hollow Creek boys years ago. Didn't stay long." Ward smirked. "Long enough to shoot a man in Tucson." Gideon's jaw shifted. "He was beating a child. I stopped him." Lucy gasped softly. Maggie's breath stilled. Sheriff Avery folded his arms. "You bring proof, Ward, or you bring silence. Till then, Gideon stays free." Ward shrugged a serpent's shrug. "Suit yourself. I'll be around." He tipped his hat and sauntered out, the kind of exit meant to leave a stain behind. The moment he vanished, Gideon's shoulders dropped, and he exhaled like a man who'd been carrying years up a mountain. Maggie stepped forward. "Why didn't you tell us?" Gideon looked at her, eyes storm-dark, swirling with regret. "Because I ain't the man I used to be." "You left them," Maggie said. "You changed." "Some changes don't matter to people who want you guilty," he murmured. The next days grew taut and uneasy. Ward lingered in town like a snake in tall grass, his presence stirring old stories and ugly suspicions. Half the townsfolk avoided Gideon, the other half refused to be swayed. Maggie remained fierce in her quiet loyalty. Lucy remained loud in hers. But at night, while Maggie swept chalk dust from the schoolhouse floor, she saw Gideon sitting alone on the hill behind town, head bowed, elbows on his knees, as though outrunning memories that wouldn't tire. Then came the fire. It happened in the dead hush of midnight. Maggie jolted awake to the smell of smoke. Flames licked the schoolhouse walls, hungry and bright. Lucy screamed for water. The children, boarding overnight because their parents were miles away, cried in terror. Maggie rushed them out the back, flames snarling behind her. Lucy beat at the blaze with a blanket, eyes wild. Then Gideon appeared, shirtless, soaked in sweat, rushing through smoke like a storm breaking through night. He hauled water buckets, directed townsfolk, shouted orders with the authority of a man who'd fought too many fires of too many kinds. The schoolhouse survived, charred, trembling, but alive. Lucy's voice cut through the settling smoke. "They were after you," Gideon said quietly. "I know, and next time they won't be alone." The embers crackled. Maggie stared at the burned walls, fear rising like cold water. For the first time since they'd arrived, Silver Hollow felt fragile, like something that could crumble if someone pushed too hard. And Maggie realized something frighteningly clear. Gideon wasn't just fighting his past. It was already on its way back. Dawn rose sharp and colorless after the fire, as though the sun itself hesitated before touching Silver Hollow again. The schoolhouse still smoldered in places, thin tendrils of smoke curling upward like sighs from a wounded creature. Maggie stood before the blackened wall, fingers trembling as she traced the charred timber. Lucy hovered behind her, arms wrapped tight across her chest. "Someone tried to burn our home," Lucy whispered. Maggie swallowed hard. "No, someone tried to burn our future." Behind them, Gideon Hail approached, with a limp still lingering from the previous night's frantic battle against the flames. His face was drawn, sleepless, smeared faintly with soot that refused to let go. The town watched him now, not with open hostility, but with a heavy, undecided silence. He stood just behind the sisters, close enough that his presence steadied the morning air. "They'll come again," he said quietly, "and not just with fire." Sheriff Avery arrived at a run, his coat half-buttoned, his mustache bristling with alarm. He held a telegram in one hand. "We got word. Those bandits, the ones that hit your coach, they're camped just beyond the southern ridge, maybe 20 of them, maybe more." The word struck the earth like iron. Lucy gasped. Maggie's breath punched from her lungs. Gideon didn't blink. "He'd take the ridge," he said. "Meet them before they ride into town." Avery hesitated. "Gideon, you know the land better than any man here, but—" "There's no choice," Gideon's tone was final. "If we wait, Silver Hollow burns." Maggie stepped toward him, her voice low, thick with fear. "You'll get yourself killed." For the first time since sunrise, he looked at her fully. His eyes, dark, steady, storm-worn, held a mixture of apology and determination that made her pulse stutter. "Not if I've got something worth living for," he murmured. Lucy turned away, pretending not to hear, though her smile cracked like fragile glass. Preparations began immediately. By dusk, the church filled with townsfolk. Ranch hands, miners, shopkeepers, and a few trembling volunteers who carried rifles as if they were handling sacred burdens. Gideon stood at the front, the lantern light outlining his tall frame as he laid out the plan. "We take high ground on the ridge," he said, pacing with slow certainty. "Avery's men on the left, ranchers on the right. No one breaks the line unless ordered. Maggie, Lucy, you stay here. Guard the children. This church is your fort." Lucy raised her chin. "We won't hide." "This ain't hiding. This is protecting the future of this town." Maggie's voice was softer. "We'll do our part." Gideon nodded. His gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, as though memorizing the lines of her face. She felt it all the way down to her marrow. Before dawn the next morning, the valley smelled of cold metal and danger. Horses snorted, fog curling from their nostrils. Men tightened saddles, whispered prayers, and loaded their guns with shaking hands. Maggie found Gideon by the well, adjusting the strap of his rifle. She approached quietly, heart pounding, the air around them painfully fragile. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Yes, I do." She swallowed. "Then promise me something." He paused. "Promise you'll come back?" Gideon took her hand, her strong, work-calloused, warm hand, and held it with an honesty that nearly undid her. "If I make it back," he said softly, "I'll tell you something I should have said long ago." Maggie blinked tears from her eyes, her voice barely a breath. "Then come back." He squeezed her hand once firmly and rode with the others toward the ridge. The ridge rose like a jagged spine above the valley, casting long shadows over the scrub. Gideon crouched behind a boulder, rifle steady, eyes scanning the ravine below where the bandits' camp smooked lazily in the pale morning light. Sheriff Avery's men lay scattered along the rocks, tense and silent. Gideon exhaled. No good men died today, he told himself. The first outlaw stepped into view. Then another. Then another. When Gideon fired the first shot, the ridge erupted, a thunderstorm of bullets and shouts. The outlaws scrambled, firing wildly, as gunfire cracked through dust and brush. Gideon moved with a deadly precision shaped by old scars. Each shot was deliberate, measured, each breath calculated. But battle was chaos. From the corner of his eye, Gideon spotted two riders breaking from the group, heading toward town. His blood goes cold. "They're going for the schoolhouse," he shouted. He fired, but the riders vanished into the valley. Meanwhile, at the church, Maggie heard the distant gunfire. The walls hummed faintly with each shot. Children huddled behind benches, wide-eyed. Lucy stood with the sheriff's spare gunshot, face pale but stubborn. A ranch hand burst through the door. "Two riders coming fast." Maggie didn't think. She snatched Gideon's rifle from the pulpit and ran outside, planting herself behind the water trough as dust swelled in the distance. The first outlaw charged, firing wildly. Maggie waited, breath slow. "Let it happen," she heard Gideon whisper in her memory. She squeezed the trigger. The man flew from his saddle, gun spinning into the dirt. The second rider swerved, raising his pistol, but Lucy fired, the shotgun booming like judgment. Silence followed, sharp and stunned. Lucy let out a shaky laugh. "Well, we did that." Maggie stared at the fallen men, adrenaline trembling through her bones. "He taught us well," she whispered. And by nightfall, the bandits were in full retreat.
Sheriff Avery rode back into town bloodied but alive. Maggie ran to him. "Where's Gideon?" she demanded. Avery's expression fell. "He went after their leader, rode over the ridge alone." Cold fear gripped Maggie like a vice. She grabbed her horse and galloped into the dark, the wind ripping at her braids, the valley swallowing her shouts. She found Gideon at twilight, slumped against a boulder at the edge of the ravine. The last outlaw lay dead nearby, gun forgotten in the dust. Gideon's shirt was soaked in blood, one arm clutched at his side. "Gideon!" Maggie dropped beside him. He looked up, smiling weakly. "Didn't expect you'd come." "Of course I came." She hands pressed desperately over his wound. "You can't die here." "Just a graze," he lied, voice thin. "Guess I'm not as bulletproof as you thought." She let out a half laugh, half sob. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met." "And you," Gideon's breath shuddered, "are the most bravest woman I've ever known." His eyes softened. "You remember what I said? If I came back?" Maggie nodded, tears warm on her cheeks. "I love you," Gideon whispered. "Always did." She pressed her forehead to his. "Then you stay alive long enough to keep saying it." Gideon exhaled. "I'll try." And as the dusk settled around them like a closing chapter, Maggie held him close, refusing to let the night take him. They would escape this together, just as he promised.
Spring came slowly to Silver Hollow, slipping across the valley like a warm hand easing over a frightened heart. The land softened. Grass pushed up green shoots through winter-bitten soil. The river, swollen with melted snow, glittered like a blade dipped in sunlight. And the schoolhouse, once charred and trembling, stood proudly again, its walls repainted a bright, hopeful white. Gideon Hail healed beside it. He moved with a stiffness that would linger for months, but he was alive. And to Maggie Dalton, that alone was worth every prayer she had whispered into the dark. She visited him daily during his recovery, sometimes to bring broth or bread, sometimes to mend his bandages, sometimes to simply sit near him while he slept. Lucy teased her relentlessly. "You hover like a healing spirit," she'd say, smirking as she hemmed dresses in her small shop beside the mercantile. "At this point, he's going to think you dreamed you into existence." Maggie only smiled, the soft, secret kind, the kind she'd carried since the moment Gideon whispered, "I love you," on that ridge. Life returned to Silver Hollow in slow, generous waves. Sheriff Avery organized patrols to ensure the valley stayed safe. Ranchers rebuilt fences. Mothers filled wash lines with bright linens. And each morning, children streamed back into the rebuilt schoolhouse, their boots tapping excited rhythms across the wooden floor. Maggie welcomed them with open arms. Lucy helped at the chalkboard whenever she wasn't busy measuring cloth in her shop beside the mercantile. The twins, big, warm, unshakable presences, made the little building feel like the center of something grand. Gideon watched it all unfold from the schoolhouse porch, where he often sat, nursing his healing side while repairing odds and ends. Sometimes he sharpened tools. Sometimes he fixed broken desks. Sometimes he simply sat, eyes half-lidded, listening to the wind roll softly through the valley. He was slower now, older perhaps by a few unkind months, but steadier too, as though a missing part of him had fallen into place. One evening, Maggie approached the porch with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Gideon glanced up, and the sight of her, the warmth in her full cheeks, the confidence in her stride, made something in him settle with a quiet click. "You look stronger today," she said, handing him a mug. "You look like you already knew I would be," Gideon murmured. Maggie laughed, low and warm. She took the step beside him, leaning her shoulder gently against his. The porch glowed in the orange wash of sunset.
Children played beneath the big oak tree, chasing each other in dizzy circles. Lucy's laugh floated from her shop as she retold one of her dramatic stories to a visiting ranch hand. Sheriff Avery strolled down the main street, waving occasionally, finally at ease. For a moment, everything felt whole. "You ever regret it?" Maggie asked softly. Gideon sipped his coffee. "Regret what? Stayin' here, choosing this place, choosing—" Her voice faltered, a faint flush touching her cheeks. Gideon's hand found hers, rough but gentle. "Maggie," he said, "I regret a lot in my life, but not stayin', not this town, not you." Her breath caught. He squeezed her hand. "You're the first good thing I ever chose on purpose." Maggie blinked hard, overwhelmed by a warmth she didn't know how to contain. Lucy broke the moment by bursting onto the porch with a grin that threatened to split her face. "All right, you two," she said, hands on her hips. "We've all been patient, but when's the wedding?" Maggie sputtered. Gideon chuckled quietly. Lucy raised her brows, utterly unapologetic. "Don't pretend half this town's waiting already." Gideon looked at Maggie, a question flickering in his eyes, a question he'd been holding for months. And Maggie, heart full, courage steady, nodded once. That was all he needed. The wedding was small but radiant. The entire town gathered beneath the sprawling oak tree where the children played. The branches rustled gently above them like a blessing whispered by the wind. Lucy arranged wildflowers into bright bouquets, their colors vivid against the crisp white of Maggie's dress. Sheriff Avery officiated, wiping his eyes more than once. Ranchers stood beside shopkeepers, miners beside seamstresses. The children sat cross-legged in the front row, fidgeting with excitement. When Maggie walked toward Gideon, full-figured, radiant, powerful in her softness, he forgot every scar on his body and every ghost behind him. All he saw was the woman who had steadied his world. When he spoke his vows, his voice trembled. "You saved me," he whispered, "long before I ever saved you." Maggie's eyes shone. "We saved each other." Their kiss was not dramatic. It was tender, certain, grounding, a joining of two souls who had fought too hard to pretend they didn't belong. The town erupted in cheers. Lucy hugged them both at once, laughing and crying simultaneously. "I told you," she said triumphantly. "I told you." 3 years passed. Silver Hollow thrived in ways no one predicted. The schoolhouse was repainted every spring, its bell ringing bright across the valley. Children who once struggled now read with proud smiles. Lucy's dress shop expanded, its shelves filled with colorful fabric and warmth. Gideon grew gray at the temples, his stride slowed just enough to remind him of the battles he'd survived. But every evening he sat on the porch with Maggie, their hands intertwined as they watched the sun settle behind the ridges. Sometimes the wind carried faint whispers of hoofbeats, the ghosts of old dangers. Gideon would pause, listening, but the valley remained still. "Peaceful, ain't it?" he'd say. Maggie would rest her head on his shoulder, the way it was meant to be. He would kiss her forehead, and in that small, steady gesture lived everything they had fought for. The escape they made together, the home they built from ashes, and the love that held the valley quiet. Silver Hollow remembered its storms, but chose every day to live for its sunsets.